Marcus Aurelius, often remembered as the philosopher-king, occupies a special and almost legendary place in the long history of the Roman Empire. For he was not only an emperor, but also a thinker whose writings continue to inspire humanity nearly 2,000 years after his death. His reign marked the height of what later historians called the era of the five good emperors. That sequence of rulers Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, whose governance was seen as wise, just, and beneficial for Rome. To truly appreciate the life and reign of Marcus Aurelius, however, one must begin long before his accession to the throne, tracing the roots of his character, the environment in which he was raised, and the influences that molded him into the ruler he eventually became. Born on April 26, 121 CE, Marcus was originally named Marcus Annius Verus. His family was of noble Spanish origin, like Trajan and Hadrian before him, hailing from the Roman colony of Eucubi in Baetica. His father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, held the office of praetor, but died when Marcus was still a small child. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was from a wealthy family that owned a prosperous brickworks business, which provided Marcus with both material security and an atmosphere of education and refinement. The young Marcus was thus raised largely under the care of his mother and grandfather, surrounded by wealth, but also encouraged toward discipline and learning. From an early age, he displayed a serious and contemplative nature, preferring study, writing, and quiet reflection over games and indulgences. His family's connections soon placed him in the orbit of the imperial household. Emperor Hadrian, a man with a keen eye for talent and character, noticed Marcus as a boy and was so impressed with his demeanor that he affectionately called him Verissimus, meaning the most truthful. This nickname stuck, symbolizing the honesty, seriousness, and moral character for which Marcus would later be known throughout his life. Hadrian, who had no children of his own, began thinking about succession early and carefully managed the chain of adoption that would ensure stability for Rome after his death. At first, Hadrian adopted Lucius Aulus as his heir, but when Aulus died prematurely, Hadrian turned to Antoninus Pius with the condition that Antoninus adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, the son of Aulus. Thus, Marcus found himself tied to the imperial succession, not by ambition of his own, but by the calculated planning of emperors before him. At the age of 17, Marcus was betrothed to the daughter of Antoninus Pius, Faustina the Younger, a union that would shape much of his later personal life. Under the watchful mentorship of Antoninus, Marcus was groomed for the throne, receiving the finest education available in Rome. He was trained in rhetoric by famous teachers such as Herodes Atticus and Fronto, who became a close friend. But unlike many Roman youths who sought fame in oratory or political showmanship, Marcus was drawn increasingly to philosophy. By his teenage years, he had immersed himself in Stoicism, a Greek philosophical school founded by Zeno of Citium, which taught the cultivation of virtue, rationality, and acceptance of fate. To Marcus, Stoicism was not just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life. He dressed plainly, often sleeping on a simple bed, and tried to live as a philosopher should, focusing on discipline, self-control, and the pursuit of wisdom. He once even considered abandoning public life entirely to live as a philosopher. But Antoninus Pius convinced him that his duty to Rome required him to embrace his political responsibilities. Thus began the tension that would define his life, the desire to retreat into thought versus the necessity to act as emperor. The years of training under Antoninus Pius were critical, for Antoninus himself was a model of restraint, moderation, and dedication to duty. Marcus absorbed these lessons and grew increasingly prepared for the heavy burdens of rule. During this period, he served in various administrative and ceremonial roles, learning the intricacies of Roman governance, law, and the Senate's operations. By the time Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus was not only ready, but universally accepted as his successor. Yet Marcus did not rule alone from the start. True to Hadrian's succession plan, Marcus shared power with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother. This was unusual for Rome, where joint emperorships often bred rivalry. But Marcus's philosophical temperament and sense of duty helped him manage this arrangement with wisdom and patience. Lucius Verus, though less disciplined and more indulgent, was still treated with respect by Marcus, who worked to maintain harmony between them. Their joint reign was immediately tested by challenges. In the east, the Parthian Empire had grown aggressive, launching campaigns into Roman territory. Lucius Verus took charge of the military operations, though Marcus remained the steady hand at Rome, organizing resources and ensuring support. The campaign eventually succeeded, but soldiers returning from the east carried with them a new and deadly plague, what historians now call the Antonine Plague. This disease, likely smallpox, ravaged the empire for years, causing widespread death, fear, and economic disruption. For Marcus, it was the first of many crises that would define his reign. At the same time, Marcus's personal life brought both joy and sorrow. His marriage to Faustina the Younger was one of complexity. Ancient sources, particularly hostile ones, often accuse her of infidelity or scheming, though such accounts may be exaggerated or politically motivated. What is certain is that Marcus and Faustina had a large family, with at least 13 children, though many of them died young, a tragic reality of the ancient world. The survival of his son Commodus, who would later succeed him, proved to be one of the most fateful developments in Roman history. For Commodus's reign would undo much of what his father and predecessors had achieved. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, what defined Marcus Aurelius was his remarkable combination of emperor and philosopher. During the early years of his reign, he began writing personal reflections, notes to himself, which he never intended for publication. These writings, later collected as the Meditations, remain one of the greatest works of Stoic philosophy. In them, Marcus reminded himself to remain humble despite his power, to embrace fate no matter how harsh, to see beyond anger, ambition, or fear, and to focus always on justice and virtue. "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be," he wrote. "Be one." These words were not meant for others, but for himself, a daily reminder to live up to the ideals he cherished. The Meditations reflect the extraordinary duality of Marcus's life. On the one hand, supreme ruler of the known world. On the other, a man struggling with weakness, doubt, grief, and the burdens of mortality, just like any other human being. His philosophical insights came not from luxury, but from hardship, not from detachment, but from direct engagement with the trials of empire. Indeed, hardship soon intensified. Even as the plague weakened Rome, the northern frontiers erupted in conflict. Germanic tribes such as the Marcomanni and Quadi began pressing against the Danube frontier, taking advantage of Rome's weakened state. For Marcus, who had long preferred the study of philosophy to the clash of arms, this was a trial by fire. But the philosopher-king proved himself a capable military leader, enduring long campaigns in harsh conditions, sharing the hardships of his soldiers, and displaying both resilience and tactical skill. He spent years on the frontier, where much of his meditations were written, often in military camps along the Danube. The juxtaposition is striking. A man who would rather ponder the nature of the soul was forced to command armies, fight barbarians, and confront the brutal realities of war. This tension, however, only deepened his philosophical insights. For Marcus, war was not glorious, but a necessity. Power was not to be abused, but used responsibly. And death was not to be feared, but accepted as part of nature's cycle. His ability to integrate Stoic principles into rulership set him apart from almost all other emperors before and after. In these early years of Marcus's reign, Rome faced both external threats and internal strains. The economy was stretched by military campaigns and the devastation of the plague. The Senate, though still respected, had lost much of its old power, leaving the emperor with the ultimate responsibility for the empire's survival. Yet Marcus remained calm and steady, seeking not personal glory, but the welfare of his people. His writings remind us of how heavily the weight of the crown sat on his head. He did not romanticize power, he endured it. Unlike many emperors who saw themselves as gods or indulged in extravagance, Marcus saw himself as a servant of Rome, a mortal man tasked with an immense duty. To understand Marcus Aurelius's early reign is to understand this paradox. A man of peace compelled to fight wars, a man of philosophy compelled to govern an empire, a man of humility compelled to wield absolute power. And yet, through it all, he remained true to his Stoic convictions, showing that it was possible, even in the highest office, to strive for virtue and wisdom. As we move forward into the later years of his reign, we will see how Marcus confronted even greater trials wars that dragged on for decades. Betrayals from within, the personal grief of losing children, and the looming question of succession that would ultimately haunt his legacy. But even in the earliest chapter of his life, as Emperor Marcus Aurelius demonstrated, why he is remembered not just as a Roman ruler, but as a timeless philosopher whose thoughts on virtue, duty, and endurance continue to speak across the centuries. When Marcus Aurelius fully assumed the responsibilities of Roman emperor, following the death of Antoninus Pius in 161 CE, the transition of power seemed at first smooth and peaceful. Yet within months, events would test Marcus in ways he could not have foreseen. The reign of Marcus Aurelius, often remembered for its Stoic wisdom and philosophical depth, was in truth marked by nearly constant crises. In this second stage of his life and rule, Marcus emerged as not merely a philosopher-emperor, but as a leader balancing the burdens of military campaigns, devastating plagues, political turbulence, and the personal struggles that came with power. His story during these middle years reveals a man who never sought glory, yet could not escape the weight of empire. Upon his accession, Marcus insisted on sharing power with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, despite the Senate offering him sole authority. This decision demonstrated his humility and sense of fairness, but it also reflected the philosophical values he held dear. He believed in duty, cooperation, and justice. By naming Lucius as co-emperor, Marcus established the first time in Roman history when two emperors ruled simultaneously with equal powers. Many in the Senate and Roman aristocracy doubted whether such an arrangement would work, but Marcus's decision was driven by loyalty and a sense of obligation. Antoninus Pius had raised both young men as heirs, and Marcus honored that arrangement faithfully. Their joint rule was immediately tested by external threats. In the east, the Parthian Empire had grown bold under King Vologases IV, who sought to expand his influence by attacking Armenia, a kingdom caught in the middle between Rome and Parthia. Armenia had long been a buffer state, and the Parthians' move to place their own candidate on the Armenian throne was a direct challenge to Roman authority. Rome could not ignore such a provocation, for control of Armenia ensured security in the eastern provinces and safeguarded vital trade routes. Marcus Aurelius, recognizing his own inexperience in warfare, entrusted Lucius Verus to lead the campaign. Though Marcus stayed in Rome, overseeing governance and law, the campaigns in the east became a defining episode of their joint reign. Lucius Verus, accompanied by seasoned generals such as Avidius Cassius, marched to the east, and after years of fighting, the Romans achieved victory. Armenia was restored as a client kingdom loyal to Rome, and the Parthians were pushed back, their capital Ctesiphon briefly occupied. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. Roman soldiers returning from the east brought with them a devastating plague, later known as the Antonine Plague. The disease, possibly smallpox or measles, spread rapidly throughout the empire, claiming countless lives. Estimates suggest that millions perished, reducing the Roman population by perhaps 1/3 in some areas. The plague did not discriminate, striking rich and poor alike, soldiers and civilians. Entire towns were depopulated, fields lay untilled, and armies were weakened. For Marcus Aurelius, the plague became a permanent shadow over his reign, forcing him to rule an empire under constant threat of collapse. Even as the plague ravaged Rome, trouble brewed along the northern frontiers. Germanic tribes, notably the Marcomanni and Quadi, began pressing into Roman territory across the Danube. These tribes, pressured by movements of other peoples and attracted to the wealth of the empire, launched raids that penetrated deeper than ever before into Roman lands. In 167 CE, the situation grew so dire that Marcus Aurelius personally took command of the Roman armies. Though not a natural soldier, Marcus rose to the challenge. He studied military strategy, consulted his generals, and committed himself to the defense of the empire. His campaigns along the Danube, later called the Marcomannic Wars, would occupy the remainder of his reign and define his legacy as a warrior philosopher. The hardships of these wars cannot be overstated. Roman armies faced not only fierce barbarian resistance, but also the unrelenting toll of disease and shortages. Yet Marcus showed extraordinary resilience. He lived among the soldiers, sharing their hardships, eating their rations, and enduring the cold winters along the frontier. His presence inspired loyalty and respect. Many ancient sources describe how Marcus was not a charismatic battlefield commander in the mold of Julius Caesar or Trajan, but rather a steady, principled leader whose calmness under pressure steadied his men. This stoic resolve, born of his philosophical training, made him uniquely suited to endure the long and grueling conflict. It was during these years, often in military camps along the Danube, that Marcus Aurelius composed the writings that would later be collected into his famous work, Meditations. Written in Greek, not Latin, the Meditations were never meant for publication, but rather served as his private journal, a source of reflection and self-examination. These writings reveal the inner struggles of a man burdened with immense responsibility, constantly reminding himself to act with virtue, patience, and justice. He wrote about the fleeting nature of life, the inevitability of death, and the importance of living in accordance with nature. He reminded himself not to be corrupted by power, to remain humble, and to serve the common good. Few rulers in history have left behind such a profound record of their thoughts, and the Meditations remain a cornerstone of Stoic philosophy even today. While Marcus Aurelius wrestled with these personal and philosophical reflections, he also faced significant challenges within the empire. The Senate often resisted his decisions, jealous of imperial power, while ambitious generals occasionally threatened stability. One of the most dramatic moments came in 175 CE when Avidius Cassius, the very general who had distinguished himself in the east against Parthia, declared himself emperor. Rumors had spread that Marcus Aurelius had died, and Cassius seized the opportunity to claim the throne. For Marcus, this rebellion was a bitter betrayal, for he had trusted Cassius deeply. Yet his response was characteristic of his Stoic nature. Rather than launching a bloody purge, Marcus offered clemency to those who had supported the usurper. Cassius himself was murdered by his own officers before Marcus could respond, but the emperor made no effort to punish his followers harshly. Instead, he traveled to the eastern provinces to restore unity and reaffirm loyalty through patience and diplomacy. His ability to temper justice with mercy distinguished him from many emperors before and after. At home in Rome, Marcus continued to legislate reforms aimed at improving justice and protecting the vulnerable. He enacted laws to aid slaves, orphans, and widows, demonstrating his compassion and concern for fairness. He curtailed excessive cruelty by masters, improved conditions for gladiators, and sought to make trials more equitable. These measures reflected his philosophical beliefs that the emperor was a servant of the people, and that justice was the cornerstone of good governance. In an age when emperors often ruled with unchecked cruelty, Marcus Aurelius stood apart as a man who sought fairness even when circumstances encouraged brutality. Yet Marcus was not free of personal grief. His beloved wife Faustina, who had borne him many children, died in 175 CE. Their marriage had been strong, despite occasional rumors of her infidelity spread by hostile sources. Marcus deeply mourned her death and honored her memory by deifying her and establishing charities in her name. His children, too, brought both joy and sorrow. Many of his offspring died young, a common tragedy in antiquity. Of his surviving sons, the most significant was Commodus, who would one day succeed him. Marcus placed great hopes in Commodus, but the young prince showed signs of weakness and vanity that troubled many observers. Nevertheless, Marcus clung to his duty as a father, preparing his son for rule despite the warnings of others. By the late 170 CE, the Marcomannic Wars dragged on, and Marcus spent much of his time on campaign. He launched offensives deep into barbarian territory, winning victories, but never fully securing the frontier. His vision was to establish new provinces north of the Danube, ensuring a permanent Roman presence in the region. Such a move would have expanded Roman control and created a stronger buffer against Germanic incursions. Yet constant resistance, the plague, and limited resources made this ambition difficult to achieve. Still, his persistence demonstrated his determination to protect Rome, even at great personal cost. He endured harsh winters, long marches, and endless councils of war, all while continuing to write reflections in his meditations. One particularly famous incident from these campaigns illustrates Marcus as leadership and the role of faith in Roman life. During one battle, Roman troops were surrounded and suffering from thirst. According to accounts, a sudden rainstorm saved them, quenching their thirst and revitalizing their strength. Some sources attributed this miracle to Christian prayers, others to the magic of Egyptian soldiers, and still others to divine favor. Regardless of its true cause, the incident boosted morale and was immortalized in art, including on Marcus Aurelius's column in Rome. It became a symbol of divine support for his rule, reinforcing his authority during times of hardship. Throughout all these trials, Marcus Aurelius remained unwavering in his Stoic outlook. He accepted suffering as part of life, saw death as a natural end, and constantly reminded himself of the impermanence of all things. His ability to balance the demands of empire with his inner philosophy makes him unique among rulers. Unlike conquerors who sought glory or tyrants who indulged in excess, Marcus lived simply, valued wisdom over power, and never forgot his duty to the people of Rome. By the end of the 170s, the empire had endured plague, rebellion, and endless wars. Yet it still stood strong under Marcus's guidance. He had proven himself not only as a philosopher, but also as a capable military leader and just ruler. But the struggles were far from over, and the final years of his reign would test him further, particularly in his relationship with Commodus and the future of Rome. Marcus Aurelius, often remembered as the philosopher-king, faced during his reign a world increasingly dominated by uncertainty, wars and crises that tested both his resilience as a statesman and his convictions as a Stoic philosopher. By the time we reached the later half of his rule, Marcus was no longer a young co-ruler standing beside Lucius Verus, nor was he a man primarily struggling against court intrigues or the constant political balancing acts of early emperorship. Instead, he was a seasoned emperor, a man shaped by years of leadership, whose reign had been defined by near-constant warfare, the devastation of plague, and the unending challenges of holding together a vast empire under siege from both external and internal forces. Yet what makes this part of Marcus's story most compelling is not merely the chronicling of battles or the administration of imperial decrees, but how he continued to live, think, and reflect as a philosopher amid the noise of chaos and destruction. The later years of Marcus Aurelius are thus not just a history of Rome, but also a testament to how one individual struggled to embody wisdom, self-control, and rational duty when all around him seemed to unravel. The Marcomannic Wars, which began in the late 160s and continued throughout much of Marcus's reign, became the central feature of these years. Rome's northern frontier along the Danube was under constant pressure, as Germanic tribes and Sarmatian groups pushed against the empire's borders. For centuries, Rome had dealt with these border peoples through treaties, trade, and occasional military campaigns. But now the situation escalated into something much more dangerous. Waves of tribes were migrating, often displaced by other groups further east, and they sought to cross into Roman lands either for plunder or settlement. The pressure was so immense that entire Roman provinces were threatened with collapse. Towns were burned, military garrisons overwhelmed, and local populations fled in terror. The Germanic incursions into Italy itself were shocking. Rome had not seen a foreign enemy on Italian soil since Hannibal during the Punic Wars, centuries earlier. The sense of vulnerability was profound, and Marcus knew he could not rely merely on diplomacy or patchwork solutions. He committed himself to personally leading the campaigns, spending years of his reign on the frontiers, away from the comfort of Rome, living in military camps, enduring the same hardships as his soldiers. The image of Marcus Aurelius sitting in his tent, writing reflections in what would become known as the Meditations, while outside his legions fought desperate battles, has become emblematic of his reign. These writings, composed in Greek and never intended for publication, reveal a man deeply engaged in a private struggle to maintain virtue, clarity, and calmness of mind despite the constant storm of responsibility and violence around him. His philosophy was not abstract speculation, but a practical guide, a daily exercise in reminding himself of the impermanence of life, the inevitability of death, the smallness of individual ambition compared to the vastness of the universe, and the moral duty of each human being to act justly in the present moment. The very fact that Marcus could continue to think in these terms while leading Rome through some of its darkest decades illustrates the extraordinary tension between his role as emperor and his identity as a Stoic thinker. The military campaigns themselves were brutal. Marcus's armies faced harsh winters in the Danube region, often living with shortages of supplies and exposure to disease. The soldiers, drawn from across the empire, had to contend with unfamiliar terrains, ambushes, and the relentless guerrilla tactics of their tribal enemies. Accounts describe whole Roman detachments wiped out, forts burned to the ground, and the sense that the Danubian frontier might collapse altogether. Marcus, however, proved a capable and determined commander. While not remembered as a brilliant strategist in the mold of Julius Caesar or Trajan, he was nonetheless respected as a leader who stayed with his men, shared their hardships, and did not shrink from the grueling years of campaign life. His persistence eventually brought victories, though these were often hard-fought and fragile. Temporary treaties were signed. Some tribes were resettled within Roman lands as foederati, while others were pushed back across the Danube. Yet the wars dragged on, draining the empire's resources, manpower, and morale. Compounding the crisis was the Antonine Plague, which had begun earlier in Marcus's reign and continued to devastate the empire. Believed today to have been smallpox or measles, the plague spread across the Roman world with catastrophic effects. Cities were depopulated, armies weakened, and the economy severely strained. Estimates suggest that millions may have died, reducing the population of the empire by as much as 1/3 in certain regions. This was not just a humanitarian disaster, but also a political and military one. With fewer recruits available, Marcus had to resort to enlisting slaves, gladiators, and even criminals into the army, breaking with Roman traditions. The plague also undermined the empire's tax base, further complicating the financing of prolonged wars. For Marcus personally, the plague was a bitter reminder of the fragility of human life and the limits of imperial power. All the authority of Rome's emperor could not stop an invisible disease from ravaging his subjects, nor could he shield his family from its reach. Some historians suggest that Marcus's own health was permanently weakened by exposure to the disease during these years. Despite these hardships, Marcus Aurelius also demonstrated administrative competence in governance. Even while at war, he remained engaged in the affairs of state, sending letters, issuing rescripts, and responding to petitions from across the empire. His legal judgments, preserved in Roman law, reveal a ruler concerned with fairness, often showing leniency in cases of hardship and a willingness to reinterpret rigid laws to fit the practical realities of ordinary life. His philosophy of duty and justice was not mere rhetoric. It informed his rulings and policies. He sought to strengthen the institutions of the empire, even as its foundations trembled under external pressure. Moreover, Marcus was deeply conscious of his responsibility to posterity. He knew he was not merely fighting for his own reign, but for the stability of Rome's future. His concern for the long-term survival of the empire shaped his decisions, even when they required harsh measures or unpopular sacrifices. It was during this later period, while entrenched in the Marcomannic Wars, that Marcus experienced some of the most famous episodes of his reign. One of these was the so-called reign miracle of 172 CE. According to ancient sources, during a desperate battle against the Quadi, a Roman legion was surrounded, exhausted, and dying of thirst in the heat of summer. Suddenly, a thunderstorm broke out, providing the Romans with water and terrifying their enemies with lightning strikes. Later writers attributed this event to divine intervention, with some Christian sources claiming it was the result of Christian soldiers praying, while pagan accounts credited the gods or Marcus's piety. Regardless of interpretation, the event was remembered as a moment when fortune seemed to favor Marcus and his men in their direst hour. Another significant episode was his campaign against the Iazyges, a Sarmatian tribe, where Rome achieved important victories that temporarily stabilized the frontier. Marcus even envisioned creating new provinces, north of the Danube, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, though these plans were ultimately abandoned due to ongoing instability and his own failing health. Meanwhile, the emperor's personal life grew increasingly strained. The death of Lucius Verus years earlier had left Marcus as the sole ruler, bearing the immense burden of leadership alone. His wife Faustina the Younger accompanied him on campaigns and remained a central figure in his life, though her reputation in later sources is marred by rumors of infidelity and intrigue, many of which may have been exaggerations or political slander. The couple had numerous children, but the mortality rate was tragically high. Many of their children died young, another reminder of the fragility of human existence even for Rome's first family. Among their surviving children was Commodus, who would eventually succeed Marcus, and whose reign would mark a sharp departure from his father's ideals. The shadow of succession loomed larger as Marcus aged. His health was deteriorating, likely worsened by the years of campaign, exposure to disease, and constant stress. He recognized that his time as emperor was drawing to an end, and that the question of who would rule after him would shape Rome's destiny. Unlike his predecessors in the so-called Five Good Emperors, who had chosen successors based on merit through adoption, Marcus broke with this tradition by preparing his biological son, Commodus, to take the throne. Some historians have speculated that Marcus, deeply attached to his son and bound by paternal duty, hoped to secure stability through dynastic continuity. Others argue that his judgment was clouded by family loyalty, as Commodus would later prove to be an erratic and self-indulgent ruler whose policies weakened the empire. Regardless, the decision marked a turning point in Roman history, for the empire shifted away from the principle of adopting capable heirs and back toward dynastic succession. As Marcus campaigned along the Danube in the late 170s, his body weakened further. By 180 CE, while in the city of Vindobona, modern Vienna, or possibly Sirmium, he fell gravely ill. Surrounded by his officers and aware that death was near, he reportedly maintained his composure, embodying the Stoic principles he had lived by. Ancient accounts describe him encouraging his men to be brave, to continue the fight, and to remain loyal to the empire and to his son. His final moments reflected the very philosophy he had recorded in his meditations: the acceptance of death as a natural process, neither to be feared nor avoided, but embraced with dignity. When he died in March of 180 CE, Rome lost not just a ruler, but a figure who had become a symbol of wisdom, endurance, and virtue in a time of great turmoil. Marcus Aurelius's death marked the end of the Pax Romana, the long period of relative peace and stability that had begun under Augustus and had been maintained, despite challenges, by the emperors who followed. With Commodus as his successor, the empire would soon enter a period of instability and decline, often traced back to Marcus's decision to prioritize dynastic succession over merit. Yet Marcus's legacy cannot be judged solely by the misrule of his heir. His reign was one of the most difficult in Roman history, beset by nearly continuous crisis, and yet he managed to preserve the empire, to maintain its institutions, and to leave behind a body of philosophical reflections that continue to inspire readers nearly 2 millennia later. The Meditations, which survive as one of the great works of world literature, provide an intimate window into Marcus's mind. They are not systematic treatises, but personal notes, reminders to himself about how to live in accordance with reason and nature, how to endure suffering, and how to act justly. They reveal his struggles, his doubts, and his efforts to remain true to his principles in the face of overwhelming challenges. In this sense, Marcus Aurelius remains unique among rulers. While many left behind monuments, conquests, or reforms, Marcus left behind his thoughts, his inner dialogue, which allows us to glimpse not just the emperor, but the man. And his words have endured, guiding countless individuals through their own struggles with adversity, is perhaps the greatest testament to his reign. Thus, the later years of Marcus Aurelius's life were marked by a profound duality. On one hand, he was an emperor at war, battling relentless enemies on the frontiers, struggling against plague, and carrying the crushing burden of ruling a vast empire in crisis. On the other hand, he was a philosopher, continually turning inward, seeking wisdom, and striving to live in accordance with his Stoic ideals. This tension defined his reign and has immortalized him as both a leader and a thinker. In the end, Marcus Aurelius exemplifies the possibility of maintaining integrity and humanity even when surrounded by chaos, leaving a legacy that resonates far beyond the history of Rome itself. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, entered the later phase of his reign with a mixture of philosophical calm and a sense of looming inevitability. For by the time the 170s had passed, he was ruling a Roman empire beset on nearly every frontier, challenged by internal weariness and external threats, and burdened by the unavoidable awareness of his own mortality. This period, stretching into the 170s and early 180s, is often seen as the culmination of his life's struggles, and also the setting in which his thoughts, preserved in the famous Meditations, shine most brightly against the backdrop of darkness. For in the final decade of his rule, Marcus Aurelius was no longer simply an emperor or a Stoic thinker. He had become a man locked in a desperate effort to preserve the empire while reconciling himself to the certainty that no man, not even the greatest, could halt the endless passage of time. The Germanic wars, which had dominated the empire since the late 160s, refused to fade. Even after victories were secured by Rome's legions along the Danube and campaigns were carried deep into enemy lands, the frontier remained a tinderbox. Whole tribes had been displaced by migrations, hunger, and pressure from peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube, and Marcus recognized that there would never be a permanent end to these waves of invasion. He had thought about resettling conquered tribes within Roman territory to strengthen the empire with new labor and soldiers. But the Senate resisted such ideas, fearing that barbarians within the borders might undermine Roman unity. Yet Marcus Aurelius, ever pragmatic, realized that Rome's strength could only endure if it adapted, even as the institutions around him clung to older ways. Still, he pressed on with the campaigns establishing fortresses and colonies along the Danube, a plan some historians believe might have resulted in the creation of entirely new provinces in what is today Bohemia and Moravia, had he lived long enough to complete them. These final wars consumed enormous resources. The empire had already been weakened financially by the Antonine Plague, and Marcus had been forced to sell off treasures from the imperial palace to fund the legions. Now, the continued strain of war pushed Rome's treasury to the brink once more. Soldiers needed pay, roads needed repair, supply lines had to be maintained across treacherous terrain, and winter camps had to be built in hostile lands where survival depended on preparation. Marcus did not shy away from the burden. He worked alongside generals, personally oversaw the logistics of campaigns, and endured the same conditions as his men. Ancient writers note that his patience and resilience were legendary, and it is easy to imagine the philosopher-emperor sitting in his tent by lamplight, pen in hand, recording thoughts in the Meditations, reminders to himself that fortune was fleeting, that death was inevitable, that virtue lay in endurance, and that the universe was governed by a rational order, even if human eyes could not perceive it. The Meditations are central to understanding Marcus Aurelius in these years. Written in Greek, the language of philosophy, they were not composed for an audience, but rather as private reflections, almost like letters to himself. In them, Marcus tried to steady his mind amid chaos, reminding himself that anger, grief, and fear were natural but must be mastered. He wrote about the insignificance of fame, noting that all who remembered the deeds of emperors would themselves eventually die, and he urged himself to live each day as though it were his last, performing duty without hesitation or complaint. That these words survive is remarkable, for they reveal not the public face of a Roman emperor, but the intimate thoughts of a man who bore the heaviest of burdens. There is no boasting in the Meditations, no triumphalism, no flattery, only the quiet, honest struggle of a human being trying to live well in a world filled with suffering. Yet philosophy alone could not shield him from the hardships of family and succession. His beloved wife Faustina died during these years in 175 while accompanying him on campaign. Ancient sources, colored by rumor, sometimes cast suspicion on her character, but Marcus never allowed such gossip to tarnish his public devotion to her. He mourned deeply, granting her divine honors and dedicating temples in her name. For a man who had endured plague, war, and betrayal, this loss struck at the core of his humanity. In his writings, there are passages that reflect a profound acceptance of mortality, but one can sense the personal sorrow behind his philosophical detachment. Her death also raised the urgency of questions regarding succession, for Marcus's surviving son, Commodus, was now his clear heir. The story of Commodus is a tragic shadow over Marcus Aurelius's legacy. Trained from youth to follow in his father's footsteps, Commodus was formally elevated to co-emperor in 177, when Marcus, recognizing his own failing health, wanted to ensure a smooth transition. But the character of Commodus was in sharp contrast to his father's. Whereas Marcus was disciplined, modest, and thoughtful, Commodus was vain, reckless, and indulgent. He showed little interest in philosophy or governance, and preferred the thrills of gladiatorial games and personal luxury. Ancient historians, especially Cassius Dio and Herodian, portray him as a disastrous ruler whose reign marked the beginning of Rome's decline into chaos. Whether Marcus fully recognized his son's flaws is uncertain. Some suggest he must have seen them, but hoped that time, education, and responsibility would mature him. Others argue that Marcus, bound by duty and tradition, felt he had no choice but to leave the empire to his biological heir rather than adopt a more suitable candidate, as earlier emperors had done. If the succession weighed on Marcus's mind, so too did rebellion. In 175, Helvidius Cassius, one of his generals, declared himself emperor after mistakenly believing Marcus had died. Cassius was respected as a capable commander, but his usurpation failed almost immediately once Marcus's survival became known. The emperor, true to his character, responded not with fury but with clemency. He promised pardon for Cassius, though the general was assassinated by his own officers before Marcus could act. This episode, though brief, reveals the fragility of imperial authority even under a respected ruler like Marcus Aurelius. It also demonstrates Marcus's commitment to mercy, a Stoic virtue he carried into the very heart of politics, where vengeance was more common. The final years of Marcus's reign were marked by unrelenting strain. He continued to campaign along the Danube, strengthening forts and preparing for further advances, but his health was deteriorating. Ancient accounts suggest he suffered from chronic illness, perhaps stomach trouble or tuberculosis, worsened by years of exposure to harsh climates and endless responsibilities. By the winter of 179 to 180, stationed at the frontier in Vindobona, modern Vienna, or possibly Sirmium in the Balkans, Marcus's condition worsened. He was surrounded by loyal officers and his son Commodus, but he must have known that his time was nearing its end. On March 17, 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died, likely at the age of 58 or 59. His passing marked not only the end of a reign, but also the close of an era. With him, the line of the so-called five good emperors came to an end, for his successor Commodus would govern in a manner that shocked and dismayed Rome. The Senate, people, and army mourned Marcus sincerely, for he had ruled with justice, patience, and devotion during some of the most difficult decades in Roman history. He was deified, as was customary for emperors, but in his case, the honor was genuine rather than hollow. In reflecting on Marcus Aurelius's last years, one sees the full contrast between philosophy and power. He had striven to live in accordance with Stoic ideals, to act justly, to accept fate, and to bear suffering with dignity. Yet he was also an emperor who commanded armies, dealt with treason, endured personal grief, and made political compromises. His reign demonstrates that philosophy is not a refuge from the world, but a means of engaging with it more honestly. The Meditations, written in tents, on battlefields, in moments of sickness and weariness, remain one of the greatest testaments to the endurance of the human spirit. The irony of Marcus Aurelius's life is that his personal wisdom could not prevent the empire from slipping into decline after him. Commodus, taking power upon his father's death, would undo much of the stability Marcus had preserved. Yet Marcus could not control the future. He could only control himself, and in that he succeeded. His reign stands as a symbol of duty, carried out under impossible circumstances, of a man who remained a philosopher even while ruling the most powerful empire in the world, and of a leader whose writings continue to inspire, not because of military victories or political achievements, but because of the timeless honesty with which he faced life and death. Thus ends the reign of Marcus Aurelius, not with grand conquest or spectacle, but with the quiet dignity of a man who lived and died in accordance with the principles he valued most. His body may have been laid to rest, his empire handed to a flawed heir, but his words survived, whispering across centuries to remind each generation that virtue lies not in fortune or fame, but in the strength to endure with justice, wisdom, and humility in a world that offers no guarantees. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the five good emperors, stands as a paradox in Roman history. He was a man who never sought power, yet bore the crushing weight of it with duty. He lived through ceaseless wars, plagues, betrayals, and personal losses, yet cultivated within himself a calm inner philosophy that has outlived his empire. In this final part, we examine the last years of Marcus Aurelius's reign, his death, the succession of Commodus, and how his legacy as the philosopher-king has endured across centuries as a model of wisdom, humility, and endurance. The final decade of Marcus Aurelius's life was defined by the continuation of the Marcomannic Wars, a series of brutal conflicts along the Danube frontier. Rome's northern provinces were constantly threatened by Germanic tribes who sought to cross into Roman territory, exploiting Rome's vulnerability after years of plague and stretched resources. Marcus had little rest, often spending more time in military camps than in palaces. Unlike many emperors who lived in luxury, Marcus was known to sleep on simple cots, eat plain food, and endure the hardships of the soldiers he commanded. This was not a gesture of theater, but an extension of his Stoic philosophy, which taught him that luxury was meaningless compared to virtue, and that discipline was the highest form of strength. His army, however, was in a difficult position. The Antonine Plague had devastated populations across the empire, reducing tax revenues and manpower. The legions were weakened, and replacements were increasingly drawn from barbarian auxiliaries, some of whom had little loyalty to Rome. Marcus faced the challenge of defending borders with an army that was not what it once had been under Trajan or Hadrian. Yet he remained resolute. His campaigns brought some victories, but they also drained the treasury. He was forced to sell off palace treasures, even family heirlooms, to fund the wars. For Marcus, this was no tragedy. Wealth had no value if it could not serve the common good. During these campaigns, Marcus Aurelius continued to write his reflections, later collected as the Meditations. These writings were never intended for publication. They were personal notes, reminders to himself to live by Stoic principles. Yet they contain timeless wisdom, reminders of the fleeting nature of power, the inevitability of death, and the importance of virtue. In these private words, we see the burden of the emperor, who asked not for greatness, but for guidance on how to endure the trials of life with dignity. He constantly reminded himself that anger, greed, and vanity were enemies to avoid, and that the true measure of a man was how he lived in accordance with reason and justice. The plague continued to rage, and while Marcus attempted to bring stability, it seemed the gods themselves tested Rome. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, had long been gone, leaving Marcus to rule alone. He was not without support. His trusted generals and advisors stood by him. But his greatest challenge came not from the frontier or the plague, but from within his own household. His son, Commodus, had been groomed to succeed him, yet Marcus must have recognized the boy's flaws. Unlike his father, Commodus loved spectacle, luxury, and cruelty. He was drawn to the gladiatorial arena rather than the study of philosophy. Many historians believe Marcus should have chosen another successor, as his predecessors had done by adopting worthy heirs. Yet Marcus, perhaps out of paternal love or the pressure to secure dynastic continuity, decided to leave the empire in his son's hands. This decision would haunt Rome. In his final campaigns, Marcus Aurelius appeared aged beyond his years. He had been ill for much of his later life, suffering from chronic chest and stomach pains, yet he pressed on. His sense of duty was absolute. Even in his last days, he remained at the frontier, attempting to secure peace with the Germanic tribes. In 180 CE, in the city of Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, or possibly Sirmium, modern Serbia, Marcus Aurelius succumbed to illness, likely the plague that had ravaged his empire. He was 58 years old. The death of Marcus Aurelius marked the end of an era. With him died the age of the 5 good emperors, a period of relative stability and wise leadership that had carried Rome to its greatest heights. His death left the empire in the hands of Commodus, a man unfit to inherit his father's mantle. Almost immediately, Rome's fortunes declined. Commodus's reign would be infamous for corruption, brutality, and mismanagement, a sharp contrast to his father's integrity. Historians often mark Marcus's death as the beginning of the slow decline of the Roman Empire, a transition from the golden age of stability to the turbulence of the 3rd century crisis. Yet even as Rome faltered under Commodus, the memory of Marcus Aurelius grew. He was deified by the Senate, as was customary, but his greatest monument was not the temples or statues erected in his honor. His true legacy lay in his philosophy. The Meditations survived through time, copied and preserved by scholars, becoming one of the most important works of Stoic philosophy. These writings influenced countless generations, from Christian monks to Renaissance thinkers to modern leaders. The words of a Roman emperor, written not for the world but for himself, continue to guide people in their struggles with anger, grief, fear, and ambition. In his philosophy, Marcus saw the universe as a great order, governed by reason, where each person had a role to play. He taught that we cannot control the events that happen to us, but we can control how we respond. He reminded himself daily that death was not to be feared, but embraced as part of the natural cycle. These teachings resonate deeply today, offering wisdom in an age no less turbulent than his own. He showed that true power lies not in armies or wealth, but in the discipline of the soul. The image of Marcus Aurelius as the philosopher-king has become one of history's enduring ideals. He embodied Plato's vision of a ruler who governs not for personal gain, but for the good of all, guided by wisdom and virtue. Unlike other emperors who sought glory, Marcus sought understanding. Unlike others who built monuments, he built principles. And unlike others who feared death, he accepted it calmly, knowing that his duty had been fulfilled. To understand Marcus Aurelius is to see the tension between philosophy and power. He lived at the pinnacle of the world's greatest empire, yet he spent his nights reminding himself not to be corrupted by it. He fought wars, commanded armies, and ruled millions, yet he longed for a simple life of study. He bore the burdens of an emperor, but carried the soul of a philosopher. His story is one of the most remarkable in history, for it shows that even in the heart of absolute power, one man could remain humble, reflective, and devoted to virtue. Thus ended the reign of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE. Rome would stumble into the chaos of Commodus's reign, but the emperor's writings would endure, outliving the empire itself. His life was proof that greatness lies not in conquest or wealth, but in the quiet strength of character. Marcus Aurelius remains, across 2 millennia, a symbol of wisdom and leadership, a beacon for those who seek to live with integrity in a world full of trials. His empire is gone, but his words remain, whispering through time the simple truth he lived by. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength.